Hey everyone. So in the last video, I talked a lot about different measures, and probably the most of that time was spent talking about gross domestic product. And gross domestic product per capita and adjusted for prices is, I think, the most typical measurement of economic well-being for countries. Like we say, a country is more developed than another if it has a higher per capita GDP. A lot of the time. But this might not be the best way to measure it because GDP doesn't directly reflect human well-being. And so today, I'd like to talk about some alternative ways of thinking about development and well-being other than GDP. So, just to give you an idea of where we're heading, first we're going to talk about some of the shortcomings of GDP. We're going to talk about well-being as a broader concept than income and happiness. We're going to talk about gross national happiness as an alternative to gross domestic product, and what lessons we can learn from countries that tend to do well in happiness surveys and in gross national happiness. And then finally, I'd like to close by talking about why economists are so obsessed with output and why maybe we shouldn't be anymore. So, diving right into it, I had you read the Kennedy speech. Kennedy lists many problems with GDP. So, he says we should be concerned about poverty, malnutrition, unemployment, hopelessness, jobs, old industries, and discrimination, of course. And so, these, in addition to provision of public goods, are all things that aren't really well captured in GDP. GDP doesn't tell us anything about these aspects of a society. And so, to place this in historical context, you have to remember that this is contemporary with President Johnson's Great Society program, which was this great widespread effort to reduce poverty in the United States through the expansion of government benefits and social safety nets programs. What happened there, and why the Great Society programs kind of petered out, was that this was also in the height of Vietnam. And so a society kind of only has so many resources, and we can think about those in kind of the political sphere, but also in pure material sphere, that a lot of resources were being expended upon the war that could not be expended upon expanding these social programs. And so this kind of vision of correcting the ills of society that we see in Kennedy's speech was not kind of brought to fruition. I try to avoid just throwing up quotes a lot, but I think this is a really great line from the speech. I'm not going to read it here, but the point is that these are social ills that should be combated, and the measure that kind of gets prince of place among all measures is GDP, which tells us nothing about all of these other social ills. So what should we focus on instead? Maybe well-being. Well-being is a broader concept than just these adjusted per capita GDP values. We kind of want to ask, are people living lives they enjoy? And one way to figure that out is we can just ask people, right? We can say, here's a scale of 1 to 10. How happy are you? And that may have some value, but there's also something we need to consider, which is adaptive preference. People kind of tell themselves stories about how they feel based on the context in which they find themselves. And so somebody that is in a society where they may have no hope of advancement of their kind of material and social conditions may adapt their preferences upward to say, well, it's fine, right? And And so that's one thing we need to consider whenever we talk about pure happiness surveys, is the role of adaptive preferences and also culture. Because what makes people from one culture happy may not make other people from a different culture happy. And so these are things that should be kept in the back of your head whenever we're talking about just asking people how happy they are. Another approach would be to create some sort of multi-dimensional index based on different measures of human well-being. From last class, the Human Development Index that takes into account life expectancy, education, and material well-being in the form of GDP is one such approach that kind of mixes in these things and weights them together. So just empirically, what we find is that income makes people happier, but at a diminishing rate. So essentially, going from, say, $10K to $12K a year makes you quite a bit happier, but going from $82,000 a year to $100,000 a year doesn't make you that much happier. So in the U.S., we find that once people make about $82,000 a year, happiness doesn't increase that much with income after that point. Unemployment tends to make people really unhappy, but especially so in richer countries. This may be an indication of the fact that those countries have more well-developed labor markets and more social esteem wrapped up in being employed or unemployed. There's also the reference income hypothesis, which states that for each kind of society, there is a socially acceptable income level that's consistent with like a decent living, with social respectability. And people think about that in reference to their own income. And so it's like, maybe perhaps in the US, it's like, oh, I don't own my own house, so I'm sadder because I'm a renter, right? And this kind of captures the fact that relative deprivation matters, and status matters. People compare themselves to the people around them. And so empirically, one way that this bears out is rich people tend to be happier when they live near poor people, but not really near poor people, because they can see their relative status difference. Some other aspects that affect our happiness that we find is if we work too many hours, we're unhappy. Credit card debt makes us unhappy. Commutes are just terrible for happiness. And likewise, if prices are really unpredictable, that is a stressor that makes us less happy. So that's kind of the empirics of it. Let's turn to theory for a moment. Microeconomics has a very kind of simplified view of human behavior that lets us get to kind of the root of human motivations in a way, at least when those motivations are kind of selfish in nature. We think people's preferences meet these four conditions: that they're complete, that people can rank order all possible kind of bundles of goods and services that they could afford, and they can rank them in order, and that ordering is static. Non-satiation just means that we always like bundles with more things compared to bundles with less things. We also assume that people like a mix of goods rather than bundles that are full of a lot of the same good. And finally, we impose rationality on human preferences to say that if somebody prefers a bundle A to B and B is preferred to C, then A is also preferred to C. This is also sometimes called the transitivity assumption. And so this simplification of human behavior lets us kind of strip down things to look at just pure kind of selfish human motivation. And it's really helpful in some contexts, particularly if we're talking about, say, business, right? But it's less useful in other contexts because people do things all the time that are not consistent with these kind of non-satiated, rational, complete, selfish motivations. People have altruistic preferences. We help out other people with no expectation of reciprocity. We also have preferences for social esteem. We may do things that provide no material benefit to ourselves, but just give us the warm fuzzies, right? Or give us kind of social status as a result. This is perhaps why people donate money to charity. And finally, we don't behave in a way consistent with these assumptions a lot of the time because we have biases. We just make mistakes. We'll talk about those in more detail later on, but things like the anchoring effect, the endowment effect, those sorts of things. Or if people have incomplete information, they can't make perfectly rational decisions. And so these are things that kind of move us away from this perfect micro world where people just reach out towards goods that make them happy and shrink away from goods and services that make them unhappy. So, an alternative measure that came to be originally in Bhutan as a supplement to gross domestic product was gross national happiness. There's a bunch of different ones out there now, but I'm sticking with gross national happiness because it's kind of one of the oldest. Bhutan's actually incredibly interesting. Bhutan was a monarchy, and the king made this pronouncement that gross national happiness would be the national goal rather than gross national product. And in a few kind of years later, he actually peaceably abdicated to a democratic government. And so I think that that's kind of a very strange turn of events that we wouldn't expect. But this is a line from kind of one of those initial statements about gross national happiness is not about momentary happiness as from buying something new. It is about contentment that comes from family, community, spirituality, education, yes, material things, but also good governance, good relationships with nature, and good physical health. And so it's this kind of a statement that it's a broader view of human well-being than pure material things. But while still recognizing that we need material things to be happy. And so they've developed measures for each of these domains. So psychological being health, time use. Once again, if people are working too much or too little, they're unhappy. So we care about time use. Education, cultural diversity and resilience, good governance. People in societies that tend to have a lot of corruption tend to be less happy. So we care about good governance. Community vitality, ecological diversity and resilience, and then finally living standards, including material well-being. And so these are all kind of lumped together, weighted to produce an index. And so just like the Human Development Index, it ranges from 0 to 1. This map is a little bit different. Essentially, they just kind of highlight countries in darker blue if they are thriving if a percentage of their population is considered thriving in 3 or more elements of the gross national happiness. And so here they've kind of got Panama at number 1 and Afghanistan at the bottom of the list there. And you can kind of see the relative ranking based on which shade of blue each country is in. And so looking at this, it's a little bit different image than the Human Development Index, though. Like, yes, Europe and their offshoots tend to be doing better than some other countries, but we also have some darker blue spots in places we might not expect. For instance, South America seems to be doing fairly well. There's a few kind of more happy countries in Africa than we would expect mapping directly from the Human Development Index. And we also have some more kind of dark spots in Southeast Asia. So different ways of measuring, you kind of get different things. But remember, this is an index, and they're weighting a bunch of different things. So keep that in mind. Using the more kind of simple methodology of just asking people how happy they are, is another way. And taking that as our jumping off point, countries that rank high in self-reported happiness tend to share a lot of qualities, and we can kind of look at that as a guiding principle to say, like, okay, what interventions in society would make people happier? And these top countries tend to be more egalitarian in a political sense, more economically equal. They tend to work fewer hours compared to countries like, say, the US, and they tend to also have a very high tax rate. So, taking from these kind of lessons from these happy countries, we find that community is important. People are happier whenever there's a great degree of trust, generosity, and a lot of these countries engage in some very kind of small-scale intervention to create community, creating more public spaces and things like that. So, just a second. And then they also tend to have a lot of social safety nets that allow people to pursue work that they find meaningful. So in other words, people can kind of maybe remain unemployed for a period longer and find a job that's a better fit than maybe in places like the US or the UK where the social safety net is less permissive. We also find on individual levels that those that are motivated by wealth tend to end up less happy than those with other motivations. People also tend to self-report that social activities rank as happier than solitary activities. And this has a nice intersection with the idea of time use being important because social connections take time. And so we need to make sure that people aren't pursuing employment solely and that they have time to do other things. And that makes them happier. So one may suppose, hey, we just need to work less. And then some economists may argue, well, then we're going to produce less and we have to accept lower living standards. But it's something that comes up kind of in more radical labor econ literature is that many jobs that exist today produce not that much social value. And a lot of us are engaged in a high degree of unproductive presenteeism. For instance, many people have to be present at a job for 40 hours a week, but they can complete all the tasks that they do in that week in, say, 20 hours or 30 hours. And so essentially that's 10 to 20 hours a week that are just wasted time. A broader idea is this idea of bullshit jobs. And so a bullshit job is a job which is just, in essence, pointless. Feel free to read the whole quote there. But the idea is that both the person doing the job knows this job doesn't create any real value, but it does consume their time and attention. And so I'll link the essay where this is from, but this is the idea of a bullshit job comes from an anthropologist that essentially argues that many jobs are just exist to kind of be busy work. And so I bring these concepts up just to point out that there is a lot of space in the world of work for people to work less without giving up all that much productivity. So more work makes Americans less happy unless they happen to be unemployed. So really zooming in just on the U.S. case for a sec, American rates of anxiety and depression have increased substantially over the last 50 years. Roughly a quarter of Americans suffer from some mental illness, and some 16% will experience a major episode of depression at some point in their lives. And these figures are among the highest in the world and double to triple those in many other wealthy countries. For instance, about double to the European average. So jumping off from this point, some suggest that one of the most important things we can do to increase happiness levels would be to just devote more resources to mental health care. I would also assert there that we need people to work less so they have more time to pursue and take care of their own health. So we work long hours. We lack a lot of the social supports that other developed countries have. And kind of related to this is a decline in community. There's a very famous book that came out quite a while ago at this point called Bowling Alone. And in this book, the kind of main example from it is that as of the publication of the book, more Americans were bowling than ever before. But the vast majority of them were bowling alone rather than part of leagues or teams. And this was the kind of emblematic case, or the illustrative case of the book, to say that American community was in decline. We're becoming more solitary. And from what we've seen in these lessons from other kind of happier countries, this is a big negative. And so there might be an important case to argue that we should intervene to create more opportunities for individuals to form social connections and communities. And one way is constructing happiness into the environment, creating spaces where people can congregate. Now, while economics is a broad profession, and the economic system touches almost every aspect of our lives, some may argue that it may not be the role of the economic system to provide the opportunity to create social connections. That's something that sits outside the economic realm. To that point, I would like to highlight some of the thoughts of Adam Smith, because Adam Smith really thought that economic activity was principally social. This is from the book that many fewer people have read, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. But in Smith's idea, we become moral by observing how other people behave. And in doing so, we kind of construct this fictional, impartial spectator that views all of our actions. And that impartial spectator that's kind of like your conscience makes you feel good or feel bad based on how morally you behave. And Smith saw economic activity as an integrated part of human life. He saw that if you kind of go out and you have market transactions with people, you're talking to them, you're behaving in them, you're behaving with them, you're responding to the way that they behave, you're kind of further developing this impartial spectator. You're forming more social connections that kind of fall along these economic lines, but simultaneously, at least in Smith's estimation, you're also becoming a better person. You're becoming more moral. I think that's kind of a nice adjacent thought to this, but it's always dangerous to try to exhume dead writers, but I really think Smith would be sympathetic to an argument that social connections, even along market lines, are one way that people become happier. So, pivoting for just a bit, why are economists so obsessed with output? There's a large pushback against these happiness measures because there's some idea that they are somewhat less objective than GDP. If I've done my job right, I hope I've at least sown a little bit of concern on your part about, well, GDP maybe isn't so objective because we exclude some things, we choose to include others, and there's a lot of estimation that goes on. It's still a good measure for some things, but it's not objective in any sense. And so it's, I think, a little bit uncharitable to say that GDP is in any way more objective than these other happiness measures. They're just different tools for different jobs. And so economists kind of have put GDP on this pedestal. And I think there's an important historic reason for that. Economics kind of came into its own as a profession while the world was economically developing, right? And so these are societies that were still facing mass poverty. And so whenever you've got a society that's faced with mass poverty, output is incredibly important. You can't change the distribution of income to make people happier if there just isn't that much income. Income in the sense being, more broadly speaking, resources. And so pure private economic output becomes very important in that context. But maybe beyond a certain point of human development, we should devote more and more resources to producing public goods, goods that support a higher quality of life for a broad range of people who can all consume the good. Think, infrastructure, public parks. In a way, education has some aspects of a public good. And so I think a really important guiding principle here comes to us from an author, John Kenneth Galbraith's, in his book, The Affluent Society. And in this book, Galbraith puts forth the idea that we need both public and private goods, but they're complements and not substitutes. So, for instance, if we are consuming far and far more private goods we buy out on the market, we also need to mix in with that bundle public goods provided by the government or nonprofits to reach kind of maximum happiness. You can think about it this way. The kind of consumer revolution after the Second World War likely created a large amount of happiness in the terms of people consuming more and more goods. But if that's not paired with, say, picking up the litter that those goods produce, managing the environmental damage from when those goods are produced, or educating people to innovate and produce more goods, or other positive social outcomes, then, the balance is off. So just like how we as individuals probably prefer mixed bundles to uniform bundles, as a society we probably prefer bundles that have a good mix of public and private goods to those that are kind of overburdened with just public or just private goods. So, just to kind of wrap up here, we should think about what we actually want an economy to do, and then we should try to find ways to measure it. Many of the things we care about most are difficult to objectively measure, but we can still create measures that get at those concepts and let us at least track progress over time and make comparisons. And finally, there's more to well-being and development than just commodities. Development and well-being also have a large social component that we should be aware of. And so whenever we think of development, we need to think about incomes, yes, but we also need to think about all of these other public goods and things that actually make people happy. All right, so I think that's all I've got for this one. Thanks.